In this lecture, we're going to talk about various aspects of measurement, or how we define and articulate the ways in which we're trying to understand the social world. So what is measurement? Measurement for us is specifying the type of observation that we're going to use to indicate something about the social world. So if we want to look at happiness or race or ethnicity, how are we actually defining those variables? What are the attributes that go into it, and how do we measure them? So for example, how would we measure something like age? We can say, oh, how old are you? Age 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way to 125, however you want to define it. But that is one way of measuring a variable. Another way to measure the variable age is by saying, are you young or old? Are you middle-aged? So these are various ways to define the attributes within a variable. How do we define something like political party affiliation? Again, there are various ways of measuring political party affiliation. For example, we could ask our respondents, our participants, are you Democrat? Are you Republican? Are you independent? Are you American independent? Are you libertarian, green, peace and freedom? These are all various attributes that can be used in that larger variable, a political party affiliation. That's one way of measuring it. Another way could be, say, liberal or conservative or moderate. However, we can get into some very confusing situations with different aspects of the social world. For example, using the previous example of age or political party affiliation, we have a general sense of measuring it. However, there are more complex things about the social world that it's more difficult to measure, something like prejudice or compassion. So how would you measure prejudice or compassion? One might say, well, prejudice could be discriminatory remarks. So you can ask your participants, have you ever encountered discriminatory remarks about yourself? Or you can also ask them, how many times do you remember in the last year somebody shouting at you a discriminatory remark? So that's numerical, right? That's interval ratio, rather than the previous example of prejudice. Have you ever been? Yes or no, that would be categorical. How do we measure compassion? Compassion could be altruistic behavior. Compassion could be, do you donate to the Red Cross? Or when you're at the grocery store, do you donate to homeless shelters? Or do you buy meals for friends? Those are various ways in which you can measure this idea of compassion, but it's difficult because people may understand this idea of compassion differently. So why are these variables, prejudice and compassion, a little bit different than age or political party affiliation? It's because they're what we call constructs. They're theoretical variables that aren't directly or indirectly observed, but there's agreed upon sense of what that looks like. Intelligence, for example. Intelligence, do we know there's a hard measure for intelligence? The widely disputed one is the IQ measure, intelligence quotient measure. However, intelligence can be a lot of different things. It could be the IQ measure. It could be street smarts or common sense. Intelligence isn't just about education. It could be about familiarity with something. It could be about ability to learn new tasks and pick up new concepts. So intelligence, we can get a sense of what it looks like, but various people may look at it differently. So what this idea of a construct gets at is there's no intrinsic reality to that construct, but only the meaning that we agree to give to it. So it's a bunch of people coming together, a bunch of scientists, a bunch of researchers, kind of all tackling various aspects of this construct, and then we get an overall sense of what it looks like. Constructs are difficult because it's really taking theoretical ideas that we have about the social world and trying to translate them into measurable variables. So I want to make a distinction again here. We have very clear variables where it's easy to identify ways of measuring them. Age, race, ethnicity, height, religious affiliation, right? These are all things that you can just say, do you identify as part of one of these religious denominations? Yes or no, or you check mark all the ones you feel affiliated with. Whereas something like racism or threat or fear or satisfaction, these kinds of things, people can kind of get a sense of what fear looks like, what it sounds like, but we may all measure it differently. Fear may be the number of times you got heart palpitations because of a certain event, or it could be coupled with anxiety, which sounds a lot like threat. How do we define racism? Is it the number of discriminatory acts you encountered? Is it perceptions of racial discrimination? So all of these different things are constructs that are much more difficult to pinpoint. Again, we have a sense of what it looks like, what it sounds like, what it feels like, but it's hard to pinpoint one easy measure. This is why we take the step of operationalization. Operationalization is defining exactly how we're going to measure some construct or some clear variable. When it comes to constructs, however, there are various levels. So I gave the example of racism. Racism is a theoretical construct. It's a theoretical variable. It's difficult to measure. But to make it easier on ourselves, we can identify things that would indicate various levels of racism. We have constructs first, and then we have dimensions within a construct, and then indicators within each dimension. So we have the theoretical construct of racism. One dimension or one particular aspect of that construct, racism, could be institutional kinds of racism. So that means discriminatory actions or acts or experiences that operate from within a given institution. That could be, a college or university, it could be your school, it could be banks. All of these things are institutions. What we're saying with this dimension of institutional racism is that those indicators can flow from one aspect of racism. So it can flow from institutions. There can also be something like interpersonal racism, right? People saying racist things to one another. And then within that dimension of institutional types of racism, we can have an indicator or various indicators that are direct observations that we say those observations adequately reflect that dimension of a construct. Again, we're talking about racism as the construct. We've identified one subset of racism, and we said that's going to be institutional racism. And then within that subset, that institutional racism, we say, what are the things that reflect institutional racism? Well, we can say the number of job rejections someone got, comparing black individuals to white individuals, controlling for the number of applications they put out. We can talk about the number of loans denied amongst black or brown individuals compared to white individuals. We could also look at whether or not an individual or a person of color, whether or not they live in segregated housing. So these are all indications of how institutions can put forth racist actions. To break it down a little bit further, this is how it looks when we're operationalizing these constructs. So a construct is this overall large bubble. We've given that construct, in our example, we've given it the name racism. A dimension is just a small subset, a particular aspect of that larger construct. So we said institutional racism is that aspect. You see that the bubble of construct still has a lot of room. We've identified one subset, one small little bubble in the construct racism, but we say we're only going to focus on that subset dimension. We have room to identify various other dimensions in there. And then within the dimension, we say, what are the things that reflect this dimension of institutional racism? Oftentimes you have many indicators of a specific dimension. Let's say we decided on a second dimension of interpersonal racism. That second dimension could also fall within the construct, and it would have its own indicators within that dimension. So this is an example of how I would go about defining or operationalizing that construct of racism. I say, in this study of black individuals, I focus on the experience with racism. The first variable, racism, centers specifically on institutional racism, so that would be a dimension. I measure institutional racism using 3 indicators: whether the black individuals in my sample were 1, denied a job, 2, denied a loan, and 3, whether they were currently living in segregated housing. All of these measures are coded as either yes, it is happening to them, they are experiencing it, or no, they are not currently experiencing it. This is just an example of how we would define the various stages of defining a construct, defining how we're going to measure a specific variable. Importantly, this idea of measurement really gets down to how are you going to allow your respondents to have a wide array of choices. If we're measuring racism, we want to allow for them to say, yes, I'm experiencing this, or no, I haven't, or I'm not currently experiencing this. So we're creating these attributes for variables. But when we're creating attributes, we have to think about, are we giving our participants enough information so that they can choose something? We don't want to leave anybody out. We want them to say yes or no, they haven't experienced this kind of institutional racism. So to ensure that every participant has the opportunity to select a given attribute, our attributes or our variables as we list them should be exhaustive, and they should be mutually exclusive. Exhaustive means that the variable, when we're talking about its attributes, those attributes must cover all possible options for that variable. It would allow us to correctly classify all participants. Let's say we were thinking about that earlier example of political party affiliation and say, we're going to give the following attributes: Democrat, Republican, Independent. Now, in that example, our attributes are not exhaustive for the variable political party affiliation. Why? People may identify as libertarian, or they might not identify as independent, or they might identify as American independent, right? So there'd be some confusion there. So by not including all possible options, you're leaving people out. And when you leave people out, they won't respond to that question, and you wouldn't be able to analyze their data based on that question. That observation will have missing information for that variable. These attributes also have to be mutually exclusive. All your participants must be able to choose only one attribute for each variable, with a few exceptions. So what this means is that if you're taking a survey of people and you're giving the exhaustive list of political party affiliation, so every possible political party affiliation, you have to ensure that there's no overlap in the attributes you're giving. You want to exclude the possibility that they're going to have overlap in their responses. Participants should only be able to identify one category to which they belong. On the flip side, there are a few exceptions. So one of the main exceptions is a variable like race and ethnicity. Most people nowadays don't just identify as one race or ethnicity. Many people are a combination of various races and ethnicities. In that sense, a race ethnicity variable should not be mutually exclusive, because you want to allow for the opportunity for people to say, I am both this and this, or I am this, this, and this. But keep in mind that most variables should be mutually exclusive, meaning people can only identify as one category, not multiple categories. I want to come back to levels of measurement. We know that there are nominal levels of measurement, ordinal levels of measurement, interval ratio levels of measurement, and this nominal level of measurement is the least sophisticated level of measurement. And we say that because these variables only have attributes that can classify and categorize. That's it. These attributes cannot be rank ordered. So things like religious affiliation, college major, hair color, birthplace, nationality, these are things that you can't rank. You may have subjective preferences, but quote unquote objectively, these things can't be ranked. You can't rank college major. You can't rank religious affiliation. They're just categories to which people belong. So that's nominal variables. Ordinal variables are a little bit more sophisticated in that they both categorize and classify, but they have the added benefit of being able to rank order them. So things like socioeconomic status, that's always a good example. SES is a variable that you can rank. Somebody can say, I am upper class or upper middle class, or I'm middle class, or I'm working class. We know that these are all categories to which people belong. So that's the first step. We know it's at least nominal. But we also know that working class is lower than middle class, and middle class is lower than upper middle class, and upper middle class is lower than upper class. Knowing this, we know that we can place them in various orders, right? So it has the added benefit of saying we can place them in order. Finally, we have interval ratio variables, and interval ratio variables are those in which the attributes can classify and categorize, and they can be rank ordered. And the reason they can be rank ordered is because they have numbers attached to them, and there are equal numerical distances between each category. So a good example is something like income or temperature. One step above, you're going into the next higher category, so not only is it a category, it's up one category, so it's at least ordinal, and we know it's higher because the step is equal to 1 unit. So if we think about income, we know somebody making $50,000 a year is part of the $50,000 category. We know somebody making $50,001 a year is actually one step higher. We know first they're higher than 50,000, and we know that they're higher than 50,000 because they are exactly one step above. This idea of equal numerical distances just means that we know that each step on that ranking system is equal. So if somebody says, well, I make 50,000, you make $50,001, that means you are $1 higher than me. We have two other people. One says I make 60,000. Somebody else says I make $60,001. We also know that those two people are one step higher or lower than one another. So each step on that scale is the same distance. Here's an example of what that looks like. So we have nominal variables, male, female, non-binary, G and C, right? We have all of these categories that can't be rank ordered. We have ordinal measures. We have the religiosity, right? It's not important, fairly important, very important, most important. We know that most important is higher than not very important. Interval ratio variables, we have IQ scores or income, and we usually clump interval and ratio together. The ratio variables are unique in that they have a natural 0 point, like the Kelvin scale. However, we usually lump them together because most things have a 0 point, or we can go negative or positive. We just treat them as numbers with equal numerical distances. Ensuring reliability. This idea of reliability is based on the notion that if we were to go out and collect those same observations over again with those same measurements, we should get the same outcome. We should be able to see the same phenomenon. There are various methods on ensuring reliability. So we have the test, retest method, split half method. So test, retest, you go out and you test those people again. You get the same people and get observations again. A split half, you basically split your psychological inventory into half with similar kinds of questions on either half. Similarly identified questions should get similar results. While they're not the same exact questions, they should get similar results. So if you ask somebody, to which party do you belong? That's one way of asking political party affiliation. And then we ask them again later on the last half of the survey, please identify your political party. We should get the same answer on both halves, right? So it's basically rewriting questions and saying we should get the same observations on either side of that test. Using established measures, such as using, for instance, psychological inventories that have been used that are reliable in other research, and then inter-rater reliability. Basically, if I were to go out and collect observations, and then I had maybe a research assistant go out and collect those same observations from people, we should get very similar results, if not the same results. Then we have validity. Whereas reliability is saying we're getting the same or similar results every time we go out into the field, validity is saying we're accurately reflecting what's going on in the social world. If I want to measure racism, we're not going to look at whether or not somebody is a mean person. That doesn't sort of gel with the idea of what racism is. So it doesn't seem like it accurately reflects what's going on in the social world. So there are various types of validity. The easiest one is face validity. Does it seem like on its face these questions are measuring the thing that we intended to measure? And then again, from psych testing theory, we have various sorts of validity. So criterion-related validity, construct validity, and content validity. You can spend some time reading those, but we won't go into those in this class. And finally, I want to end with this idea that you don't get validity without reliability, or you don't get accuracy of the thing you're trying to measure without consistency. We have 3 examples here. We have the first example, a measure or a question is reliable but not valid. And it's reliable in the sense that all of the dots are clustered together. All of the darts have thrown at this bullseye and they've been clustered together, so they're very consistent, but they're not valid because they're not hitting the bullseye in the middle. Middle example is something that is valid but not reliable. And it's valid in that they're all generally around the bullseye. However, they're not consistent. They're just sort of all over the board. And then finally, the best example is something that is both valid and reliable. And validity and reliability we see here. It's valid in that it's really getting really close to the bullseye, and reliable because those dots are very close to one another.